Welcome back, warriors. Kwe Tansei Sego. Hi, my name is Pam Palmater, and welcome to my YouTube channel where we focus on educating the resistance and inspiring the next generation of warriors to help us save our peoples and the planet. Just before the pandemic hit, Turtle Island's attention was on the Wet'suwet'en Nation and all of the solidarity actions demanding that the RCMP and Coastal GasLink pipeline leave their territory. Then the COVID-19 pandemic hit, and while our attention was focused on protecting the health and safety of our peoples, governments tried to forge ahead with fossil fuel and extractive industry projects, despite the increased risks to our lands, waters, and people. Stay tuned to hear more about this dark side of government pandemic actions. Just before the worldwide COVID-19 pandemic hit, Native peoples all over Turtle Islands in both Canada and the US were fully engaged in solidarity actions with the Wet'suwet'en Nation, occupying roads, highways, ports and railways, even legislatures and ministers' offices. We were saying no more to Canada's breach of our land rights and to their use of heavily armed RCMP officers that removed peaceful, unarmed Wet'suwet'en peoples from their homes. We were saying no more to the violent police takedown and arrests of our allies at Tyendinaga Mohawk territory who had been occupying lands near a railway in support of the Wet'suwet'en Nation. Native peoples and Canadians worked together as allies to support the Wet'suwet'en peoples for many months. Our collective actions, advocacy, and other interventions, both here in Canada, the United States, and internationally, helped shine a light on Canada's violent oppression of our sovereign Native nations and its ongoing breach of our inherent domestic and international rights. Even the United Nations intervened and asked Canada to stand down and get out of Wet'suwet'en territory. Canada refused. So every time they cracked down on one of our solidarity actions, we made sure to create a new one. Our people refused to give in to such blatant violations of our rights. Then the COVID-19 pandemic hit, and our attention had to focus on how to best protect our nations. We know from past pandemics that First Nations in Canada and tribal nations in the US are always hit hardest and have higher rates of infections and deaths. Our sovereign Native nations have gone through decades, even centuries of genocidal policies that have left us without the majority of our lands, resources, and wealth. Canadian and US governments alike have breached our treaties more than they've honored them, and they have purposefully and chronically underfunded all essential programs and services like food, water, housing, education, and healthcare. These governments have created and maintained these conditions and left us with exceptionally poor socioeconomic conditions in many of our nations. These socioeconomic conditions, which include higher rates of poor health and chronic diseases, means that our people have higher risk levels for things like pandemics. And given the critical state of the pandemic right now, our nation should be able to focus on our own emergency measures and not have to worry about keeping a watchful eye on federal, provincial, state, and municipal governments. But recent government actions show us that this is simply not possible. First of all, despite all of the states of emergency that have been called and all of the new government rules around non-essential travel and no gatherings, the government of BC has permitted Coastal GasLink pipeline to continue its work on Wet'suwet'en territory. Even without a pandemic, this endangers Wet'suwet'en lands, waters, and peoples. The influx of primarily male workers living in man camps increases the risk of sexualized violence to Native women and girls in their own territory. Now with the pandemic, these man camps pose a significant health risk, not only to their workers, but a disproportionately higher health risk to the Wet'suwet'en peoples. This could literally be lethal to the Wet'suwet'en peoples, and it is unconscionable that any government would allow this work to continue in a pandemic. This is especially true given the fact that travel and gathering restrictions prevent Native peoples from being able to physically stop this work through occupation actions. In every news conference, world leaders are telling their people, stay home, don't gather, physical distancing. But the man camps associated with these projects have now become ticking time bombs in a pandemic. Union of BC Indian Chiefs Grand Chief Stuart Phillip has called on the government to halt construction of Coastal GasLink pipeline, citing these very specific threats to First Nations. But so far, the construction has been allowed to continue. But this isn't the only underhanded move by governments against our sovereign Native peoples. Just before the pandemic broke out, Teck Resources withdrew its application for the Frontier Oil Sands mine, much to the relief of many First Nations and Canadians, both in Alberta and beyond. While economists had predicted that this would happen simply because the project wasn't financially viable, the company was quick to blame Canada's climate change policies. Alberta Premier Jason Kenney then held a very bizarre press conference where he blamed people like Leonardo DiCaprio, Jane Fonda, David Suzuki, and myself, all of whom he referred to as zealots and urban militants, as the reason for why Teck Mine left. What a real leader would have done would be to step up to the collective challenge we all face of climate change and inspire a hopeful vision for the future, one that charts a path forward based on clean energy, new technology, and critical financial supports and retraining for workers. Instead, in the middle of a pandemic, that is not only a significant health threat, but poses a significant financial burden for many Albertans and Canadians and First Nations, Premier Kenney doubles down on his desperate attachment to fossil fuels. In a surprise announcement, Kenney said that the Alberta government would be investing a total of $7.5 billion to revive the Keystone XL pipeline. What a shock to the majority of us. While trying to justify the less than 7,000 jobs that would be created with the pipeline, he forgot to mention about the mass layoffs of approximately 25,000 education workers. Although education is the critical foundation of any country's economy, he has chosen to focus on a dying industry that makes climate change worse instead of taking measures to mitigate it. And for what? Crude has almost no value right now. And if Alberta has that much money, where are the billions of dollars in emergency pandemic funding that should be going to First Nations and impacted Albertans who are out of work? This is just another example of secretive government maneuvers done in violation of Native rights, all under the cover of a pandemic. All of the Native peoples in Alberta who fought so hard against Keystone XL now have to add this worry on top of the current pandemic. Alberta's surprise announcement, taken together with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's $15 billion bailout package for oil and gas companies, is simply astounding. 265 academics have now responded to Trudeau's bailout plans in an open letter explaining that not only is investing in oil and gas unwise, but we are already saddled with significant environmental debt in the form of remediation for the thousands of oil and gas wells, something that would cost over $260 billion. They argue, as so many others do, that what we need is a green transition and not a bailout for the oil and gas industry during a pandemic when we can't take action to stop it. But it's not just Canadian governments who are in the background working to push through laws or funding for projects they know would be opposed by many First Nations. Democracy Now! Reports that several U.S. states have quietly passed laws to criminalize protests against the fossil fuel industry. States like South Dakota, West Virginia, and Kentucky all consider the fossil fuel industry to be critical infrastructure, and any protest actions may include jail time. In another shocking move, U.S. President Donald Trump's administration is reported to have suspended environmental protections to give additional support to the fossil fuel industry. The Environmental Protection Agency issued a blanket policy decision to suspend enforcement measures and penalties in relation to any regulated entity that can show that the reason why they couldn't comply was because of COVID-19. The Natural Resources Defense Council calls this literally a license to pollute, something that many fear will disproportionately impact poor and racialized people who are always the ones that live downwind from these companies. It's almost like none of these governments can see the writing on the wall that we can see. Not only are fossil fuels limited resources, not only are they contributing to devastating climate change, not only are there sustainable energy alternatives and new technology, but this pandemic has showed us just how weak fossil fuels are. In fact, economists are saying that it is unlikely that big oil will ever recover. But just as with pandemic plans, we need a green transition plan that prepares now for the end of big oil. Tribal nations in the United States must also keep a careful eye on the federal government for many other reasons. Although the Trump administration is engaging in consultations with tribes right now on what they need in terms of the $10 billion set aside for tribal pandemic measures, it must be remembered that ultimately these are native funds taken from native lands and resources, and the United States, like Canada, is under legal obligations under treaties to provide this funding. This funding is not a favor or a charity to tribal nations or First Nations. While everyone was distracted with the votes in the Senate and the House to pass the pandemic measures, the Trump administration made a surprise decision that the Mashpee Wampanoag, which gained tribal recognition in 2007, will now have its lands taken out of trust status and lose its reserve status. Democracy Now! Reports that this move ensures that the Mashpee cannot build their casino, which would have competed with nearby casinos that have, quote, well-established ties to Trump. Tribal Chairman Cromwell said it was a cruel thing to do, literally in the middle of a pandemic, and when the tribe is in the middle of building homes for its people. So between these two countries, we have a problem. Some are passing laws to make protests illegal, all the while we're not legally allowed to gather and protest. Similarly, approving fossil fuel projects without the free, prior and informed consent of our sovereign nations is being done at a strategic time when we can't protest. To make matters worse, the mainstream media is so focused on covering COVID-19 that much of what is happening in Indian country is not well known. Meanwhile, workers continue to occupy man camps, increasing risks to Native people and even local health workers. This presents our sovereign Native nations with an incredible burden, the burden of saving the lives of our people today during the pandemic, while trying to take all necessary steps to protect the lives of our peoples from these destructive government actions on our territories tomorrow. Right now, we need to carefully monitor and report on what's happening in our territories for our peoples. We need to reinvigorate and amp up our intertribal and inter-First Nation communications. We need to inform and activate all of our social justice alliances. We need to skip over political organizations that are too closely tied to government who don't really work for us. We need to share this information with Native media, independent media, and pressure mainstream media to carry these stories and help really educate the public. And we need to ensure that we dedicate what resources we can to counter government moves that violate our rights. We cannot forget about all of our advocacy actions that we were taking just prior to this pandemic. And I know that that's a lot to ask during a pandemic. And quite frankly, I'm horrified that in 2020, countries like Canada and the US would act in such an insidious way. But this is our reality for now. While some of us are being hit by this infection or with job losses or having to worry about housing and food, it's more important now than ever for those of us who can to step up and make sure governments don't use this time to take advantage of all of our nations. And in the long term, I know we can stop them. Remember, we always have the strength of our ancestors walking beside us. I hope you all found this video helpful, and I wish you all health, safety, and shelter for you, your families, your clans, houses, and nations. Thank you for watching my channel, and if this is your first time here, please consider subscribing, commenting, sharing these videos with your family, friends, colleagues, and especially social justice allies. If you want additional resources, you can check out my website at www.pampalmater.com. Till next time, stay alert, warriors. We literally need every single one of you right now. Walaliad.